By the way, just curious, out of those of you in the room, who saw my virtual talk last year? Cool. All right. The rest of you, it's homework, okay? So hi, everyone. My name is Alex Coulombe, and I run an XR studio in New York City called Agile Lens Immersive Design. And I think that, I'm sorry, I was thinking again about the Metaverse thing. People keep asking me what I think about Facebook changing their name to Meta, and I felt like the only way I could represent it was with a meme. So this is just what I've been sending to everyone. It's just kind of how I feel about it. So to start off with who I am, we'll just go through this really quickly because I've got a lot of stuff I want to cover today. So I'll just flash a bunch of words up here for a moment. Really, the way I like to think of myself is to break this down into a designer, a developer, as well as an educator. And I'm still getting really used to having a beard. This is very new for me. I've never had one before, and I'm 34 years old, so that's been fun. And I get involved with a lot of different conferences, especially in the spirit of educating the masses. So the Fifth Wall Forum brings together very tech-focused people with people who are coming from a more traditional theater and live events background. We've put on some pretty cool events from there. The Theater Communications Group Conference is the largest gathering of North American theater professionals, and I curate all the fun VR, AR, XR content there. And then the Real-Time Conference, which had an event in April, has another one coming up next month, is a gathering of people from all over the world in different industries interested in real-time technology. And then, yes, as a teacher, I taught Unity at the Syracuse University School of Architecture, my alma mater. I taught virtual reality live performance at NYU Tisch. And now I'm a lot of Unreal Engine all the time as an Unreal Engine authorized instructor, and that's been a blast because I just get to teach every aspect of Unreal Engine to a lot of different corporate clients and whatnot, and I end up learning new things myself. So when I started to think about the talk I wanted to give today, I thought it would be useful in architecting the metaverse, social VR, NFTs, and new opportunities, that this would be kind of a sequel talk to the talk I gave last year. And it's very fitting that last year was virtual and this one is real, because today I really want to discuss the value of the virtual, but also in comparison to the real. There's certainly things in the real world that cannot compare, such as seeing all you lovely people here today. So last year, the talk I gave was about trying to distill about a decade of experience of using emerging technology. Look how young I was there. No beard. I was like 14 years old. That was the DK1, starting to explore how virtual reality could start to inform the design process, especially in partnership with Fisher Dax Associates, not just as a design review tool, but actively designing in different scenarios. So, when I first got to Fisher Dax in 2012, when we were designing theaters, there was a lot of this kind of stuff and a lot of difficulty trying to convey what's it actually like to sit in different seats and lean forward. And so even with the very earliest iteration of virtual reality, it was super useful to be able to go through those same kinds of scenarios, but feel, oh, now I'm leaning with my right arm on the railing, and how that feels differently. And then we also got to do some pretty cool things with physical mock-ups. For example, for Lincoln Center here, we started to look at actually giving you a sense of what it's like to sit in the balcony, and that railing was adjustable, so then you could actually say like, oh, this doesn't feel safe. Look how far below the ground is. And so I've always enjoyed that kind of merging of the physical and the real and the virtual in different contexts. And the lessons just from that talk, because it helps to frame the talk I'm about to give, is this: immersion doesn't require photorealism. Good to have tactility. It's good to cycle all sorts of different VR options. It's good to actively design in VR instead of just reviewing things in VR and then going back to your computer. It's good to have photorealism later on, though sketching in VR is very underappreciated early on. VR is also a great place for generating 2D media like animations and renderings. And ultimately, VR saves time, money, and headaches. So if you go to the YouTube website for AEC Magazine, you can check that talk out. And ultimately, it was about going from this kind of workflow where you are just back and forth in VR, design review, and then ultimately getting a building, and trying to figure out, how do you streamline that workflow so that's a little bit more one-to-one with the design decisions you're making and ultimately becoming a building. But today, when I think about moving forward, so this is an example of one of the projects I've done where we had a very nice workflow going from VR into the actual construction process and then the result. Today, I want to talk a little bit more about how you start to do this sort of thing, where you're ultimately not trying to create a real building. You're actually generating a virtual piece of architecture that doesn't need to be built and therefore has a different set of parameters and restrictions, but also doesn't have to deal with budgets and bureaucracies and code requirements and all that sort of stuff. So today's a little bit more adventurous, I guess you could say, than my last talk. Last year I had lessons. It's like, here's a distillation of everything I've learned. And today it's more like, here's some of the questions that I've been asking since I've been more involved with virtual versions of architecture. At ViveCon, we were sent an early Vive Focus 3 and started to explore how we could start to have events in the digital version of Brockman Hall for Opera and how that might differ from the actual events, so using the digital twin in kind of a different capacity. So you could also think of it as, last year it was, here's what I've learned about harnessing immersive text utility for architects, building real buildings. And now it's more, here's the utility I think that architects can bring with all of our skill sets to immersive tech and immersive worlds in particular. So the topics I'd like to go over today include what is virtual architecture. Oh, I wanted to let that video play for a minute. That's okay. This is a bit of a VR rage room experience when I first started to understand what you could do in VR that either you can't do in real life or would be very expensive. We started to offer this to some architect clients that were getting very frustrated with their design process and just needed to outlet some frustration, and that's still a popular feature for us. We can put it in any project at all. So we'll go over what is virtual architecture, some elements of architectural psychology, what are the unique affordances you have when you're designing a virtual space as opposed to a real one, where can we draw inspiration from outside of just architecture, and then we'll briefly touch on NFTs and how you actually make money and sell things in this realm. And I'll have some not concluding thoughts so much, but some concluding questions just to keep the conversation going. You know, again, I don't have answers today. Today is about starting to think about what the future holds for us. So we'll start off with not lesson number one, but question number one. What is virtual architecture? Let's start by framing our definition here, define our terms. So virtual architecture you can think of as the well-designed arrangement of virtual space for a specific use case. And a good example of this, I would say, would be the Museum of Other Realities by Samuel Arsenault-Bressard, who designed this as a place to exhibit virtual reality art and actually allow people to gather in here in social contexts. So it's actually a functioning space. It's not just something you download and you do this on your own. There's a lot of UX and UI and different elements of thought that go into how people go through this space together. He also designed this not just with traditional tools like Revit and Rhino, but also VR modeling tools, things like Oculus Medium. And I can tell you, as someone who spent a lot of time designing in VR, there is something quite amazing about the fact that you can be at human scale and do something as simple as change the colors of the space you're in and see how that actually changes the mood. So we'll get more into that with architecture psychology. But a bit of a fun fact, so Andrea, who spoke earlier, and Sam and myself and our other friend Kim Bauman-Larson, sometimes we just go hang out in virtual space together and we talk about what we think works and doesn't work in it. We dissect it, we think about how it can be improved. And so when Sam gave the three of us a guided tour of the Museum of Other Realities, we started to discuss his inspiration. And he mentioned Louis Kahn, of course, with his brilliant use of concrete and indirect light. Kim mentioned that it brought back the feeling of awe. Awe is a very replicatable feeling in VR, I find. The awe that he felt seeing the sculptures of Richard Serra when he visited the Guggenheim in Bilbao, and then that got him thinking about how some of the VR art in the Museum of Other Realities was in conversation with the actual architecture, and some of them felt very spatial. And that also prompted some interesting discussions about how you define art versus architecture, especially in a VR context. For me, it reminded me of the work of Morphosis. And so the key takeaway here is I recap a little bit of our discussion, was that we were all using reference points, of course, of real architecture we'd seen when discussing our experience inside virtual architecture. Also worth mentioning, my kids, who have been in VR since they were 2 years old, they will often reference how a real space reminds them of a virtual space that they've been in. So we'll walk into a new building and they'll say, oh, this is just like when I climb up the lighthouse in A Fisherman's Tale, or oh, this is just like the lobby and rec room, or this is just like that hide and seek level in Half and Half. And so it's kind of fun to imagine that if, God forbid, either of them grows up to be an architect, that these virtual architectural experiences could start to inform from a human scale perspective, how they felt and what their response was to a multi-user virtual architecture experience, that could actually inform how they start to build real architecture. And for me, the opposite of that is kind of when you have real architecture in the real world that doesn't really end up functioning the way it's supposed to. For those who don't know, House 6 by Peter Eisenman was claimed to be totally unlivable by the New York Times, as well as the people who actually lived there. And so one could make the case in some of Eisenman's work that this is more art than architecture, a little bit more sculptural. The Villa Savoy, if you don't know, had some problems. That's actually an art piece, but I think it's representative of how the inhabitants there, got very sick. There were mold problems. There was leakage. A 3-year-old boy almost died in it. But we all take inspiration from this work. That being said, virtual reality starts to allow for a bit more of a gestalt master builder approach to design. If you want to be a Corbusier or Frank Lloyd Wright, the kind of person who would sneak back into a client's house after he sold it and rearrange all the furniture because he didn't like how the client rearranged it, in virtual reality, you can say, I am locking down this furniture and no one can ever move it. You can design all the different elements of what's interactive and what isn't. So I'd like to think that architects who want that level of control over their design would be drawn to the affordances of starting to design in virtual reality, and then you're not going to make anyone sick and die unless you have a really poor frame rate on your VR headset. So in the spirit of how we start to attract real architects to design the space, well, first of all, the bar is pretty low right now. Most of the virtual reality architecture you'll see in popular platforms like VR Chat or AltSpace are not designed by architects. We're kind of in the GeoCities era of virtual architecture. We have a lot of game designers that have a certain way that they'll start to approach designing virtual architecture, or just hobbyists, people who are just trying this out, and they're not coming from any formal training, but they're just seeing what happens. Most of the popular places in VR Chat are actually just recreations or homages to real-world places like pubs or clubs or this penthouse apartment, which is high in the skyline in Hong Kong. So this question starts to become, can good virtual architecture actually look like something that doesn't look like the real world? And that's a really interesting discussion, because then we get into skeuomorphism and how much we need to be referencing things we're already familiar with in the real world, even if we're in a digital medium where there's a lot of other directions you can go. I have a whole list of quotes of things architects say or complain about like why it's so frustrating to design in the real world. And what I find fascinating going through these kinds of quotes is, these don't apply to the real world. Renzo Piano talking about how it's very hard to fight gravity. You can turn gravity off with a checkbox in virtual reality. I design a lot of theaters, of course. Rem Koolhaas talking about the problem with a shoebox being the ideal shape for acoustics. We can make any shape we want in virtual reality architecture, and we can make it sound any way we want as well. And then Louis Kahn asking what the brick wants to be. What does a virtual brick want to be? What does a pixel want to be? To me, these are interesting questions to start to ponder. Is there a true self to certain kinds of form or elements or materials or functions, code even, when you start to create virtual architecture? I give a little bit of flack to some companies like SOM and Bjarke Ingels' group, who have done some really cool work designing speculatively for, respectively, the moon and Mars. I was giving a talk in South by Southwest, and Bjarke was about an hour after me, so I went to see him. And he was saying that one of the reasons he wanted to design for Mars was he was a little bit bored with the restrictions of Earth, and he wanted to find a new design challenge. So when I see these guys, I'm like, give a virtual reality piece of architecture a shot, because designs like this are speculative. You're only ever going to see it as renders, and if they wanted to release a virtual reality version, that would be cool, but they haven't. But then if you really want to take virtual reality architecture seriously, you need to allow a function there for people to actually occupy the space together, and for that space to encourage certain kinds of behavior. So then we can start to think about, when does virtual reality architecture become successful, right? So Kim Bauman-Larson has talked about how he's seen some very successful virtual reality architecture, even from people who aren't coming from that background. So his friend Ricky had a birthday party where she wanted to have this underwater club scene and have this living wall of fish. And obviously that's not something you can do in the real world unless you actually build an aquarium and make the fish very angry so they're spinning around that quick the whole time. But Kim talked about how this for him approximated the feeling of being in a club, especially during the pandemic. He said it was the most he felt like being in a club over that year. So there starts to be these interesting ways you can begin to pull in other elements of what you can only do in the medium while still having certain familiar elements. You know, a DJ booth, you can have virtual cocktail tables, which naturally draw people to them, even if they don't have real drinks. There's architectural language that we can still use when we think about architectural psychology and how that can start to apply to virtual spaces. Things like color and light and materiality and compression and release. All of these are still tools in our toolbox. All the things that come into our training as we think about what makes an aesthetically pleasing space or functional space, that can all come to us as we start to design virtual architecture. So if you aren't architecturally literate, though, as I mentioned, a lot of the virtual architecture right now is being designed by hobbyists. And there's a few problems with that. First of all, it kind of gives virtual architecture a bad name. But it's not like I can't get mad at people who are just trying this stuff out because they're getting people into some of these spaces, you know, far more than real architects in some cases are getting into their spaces. If you design a little house in the middle of Timbuktu, let's say, you know, it might be a beautiful design, but maybe a grand total of 200 people see it over the entire course of that building's life. And there are VR chat worlds that look like this that have had 100,000 people go through them and have experienced that space in VR at human scale and been able to react to it. But, you know, I mean, to call out the scale of the doors being wrong, walking up the stairs, the roof is too short, you know, you have problems with texture being at the wrong scale, you have geometry that's like popping up in like weird places. It becomes a bit of a problem. So what we start to say whenever I get to speak to anyone who wants to venture into virtual reality architecture, especially if they haven't trained as an architect, is that you need to still treat it like a craft. Does anyone know who made this painting? Just shout it out. Come on, impress your colleagues. Someone take a guess. It's a painter. Good guess, you're right. Now, Picasso made this. This was a self-portrait. And he also made this self-portrait. Now, another question, class. Which one of these do you think he made first? Left or right? Shout it out. Yeah, good. I'm glad to hear a couple different options. So Picasso made this self-portrait when he was 16 years old. He made this one when he was 90, okay? So Picasso has this great little quote. He says, "Learn the rules like a pro so you can break them like an artist." And the problem with most virtual reality architecture right now is it's being made by people who haven't learned the rules. So they're breaking the rules with total disregard, like chaotic children, like my children when they design virtual reality spaces. So there's a lot of different ways you can approach that. And I'll give a book list at the end for, you know, if you have a friend who really wants to get into virtual architecture, but they're like, I don't want to go to architecture school, you can at least start to point them in the right direction. But the problem is that in many cases, when I see virtual architecture, I would rather just have nothing. I'd rather just be in the space and at least have like a blank canvas that I can project my imagination onto than something where I'm very uncomfortable and the colors are too loud and there's all sorts of things hurting my brain. So you can start to wonder, does virtual architecture need to exist at all? Skeuomorphism, of course, is a bit of a shorthand for how to behave in a space, but it does start to create certain weird situations. I already mentioned, like, you know, cocktail tables where you gather around them even though you don't have a drink. But of course, one of the fundamental needs of architecture is to protect us from the elements, right? And so if you don't need to worry about cold and heat and a building falling down or rain falling, how much need is there for virtual architecture? And I would answer, you know, in my very like open questioning kind of way, that it would seem to me that humans as primates that still are affected by gravity and evolution and these different subconscious processes, there's great value still in virtual architecture. The oldest part of our brains go back to our reptile brains, you can say, go back to how it feels, for example, to be sitting in a cave, let's say 30,000 years ago, and looking out into a savanna at a bunch of wild beasts and being terrified that they're going to eat you. There's this theory of prospect and refuge, which seeks to describe why some environments feel secure and safe and comfortable and other ones don't. So you actually start to address different human psychological needs with different spaces, regardless of whether or not they are real or virtual. And there starts to be certain translations. A cozy cabin in the woods can feel a little bit like what it felt like to be in a cozy cave back in the day. A nice penthouse view from an apartment, a little bit like a castle or being up in the trees. One analogy I think of all the time is every morning when I come into work from Grand Central Terminal, coming out of this tight train and then opening up into Grand Central Station probably feels a lot like running through the woods and feeling like you're surrounded by wild animals and you're not safe, and then you open up into a big open savanna, and then at least your sight lines are better and you have a better idea of what's going on, especially if you find yourself like much higher up than the wild animals trying to eat you. Because our bodies want plenty of things that are not necessarily logical or good for us. We still want tons of sugar because our bodies don't want us to die during the winter. We know it's not healthy for us, but that's still a psychological aspect of being a human that we grapple with. I also think about the context of the journey that you have going through different spaces. For me, visiting the Sistine Chapel, what impressed me the most, because I'd done like a VR version of the Sistine Chapel and said, oh yeah, it's beautiful. But the actual progression of getting to the Sistine Chapel, for those who don't know, is you go through all these tight little tiny galleries with very low ceiling. And so the contrast of being in those spaces, this compression, and then releasing into the Sistine Chapel, which is not a very big space, the contrast makes it feel more like my experience of coming out of a train and coming into Grand Central. And that's missing in VR. Most VR experiences, you log into them and the virtual architecture is suddenly just all around you. And the only time that you typically experience that in the real world, where you suddenly are just in a space and surrounded by people, is when you've had amnesia or you've been kidnapped. So that's not something we really want to encourage. We need a progression and a sense of onboarding as we make our way into virtual architecture. And that's something almost no one is thinking about. So, talking to Kim, for example, about how he approaches different virtual designs, it's still about these ideas of like prospect and refuge, of how you make people feel secure and comfortable in a certain area. He has these kind of like tight little areas they're almost like conference rooms where you can discuss things. And then this center area is for design discussion. You can load up a 3D model and start to do all sorts of things that you couldn't do in the real world version of this architecture. It's once again leaning towards skeuomorphism and certain elements that we're familiar with, but really taking advantage of what you can do in the digital space. So over the course of the pandemic, we've seen, as I mentioned with the VR chat slide, that there's a lot of virtual architecture that's based on real-world locations. So South by Southwest, which is always in Austin, Texas, big giant event that brings hundreds of thousands of people there, they did a VR chat version of this that is abstracted. It reminds me a little bit of what it's like to be in, for example, like New York City in like a Spider-Man on PlayStation, for example, where you're taking kind of the key elements of the architecture and the urban environment, but you're making it work for a different context. So being able to go to these conferences where you have a very clear idea of what the real version is like, I'll mention Burning Man in a second as well, there's something very fascinating about the design process of translating that experience in a virtual context. They also did a theater, and of course, me being someone who's been involved with 75 plus theaters, there's something nice about the translation of a real theater to a virtual one because we have a very clear sense of ritual and how you progress throughout a theater and you make that space work. We also saw things at Sundance and a few other festivals that worked pretty well. For the Venice Biennale, Venice has been amazingly forward-thinking with how they approach virtual events. They had a giant VR chat world you could explore. And they also had, this wasn't even the architecture Biennale, this was the film festival that had 35 virtual worlds in competition where they were basically judging the quality of what it was like to move around in those worlds, which is wonderful. Also part of Venice, I got to be the design lead for the very first theater experience in Venice that allowed you to simultaneously be in Venice watching the show live there, or anywhere in the world watching it in a VR headset, which was quite exciting, because then you start to think about how you have a real space and a virtual space interact with each other. Typically, we think physical and digital twin as separate entities, but here it was how do those start to play with each other in a meaningful way, especially for the audience members. And I got to do the whole thing from New York. I didn't even actually go to Venice for this, but I could go into my virtual theater before each show and like move the props around and be an invisible avatar. So if an actor dropped something on the floor, I could like put it right back up there and no one would see it, which is quite nice. I'll also mention just briefly that right now, AgileLens is developing a platform that is intended to use Cloud XR. I could talk about Cloud XR for an hour, so that people can get a really compelling live theater experience with a high fidelity of motion capture from a $300 Oculus Quest. So our first show for that is in December. Please check that out. There's actually a talk coming up by us on Thursday for GTC, which is all about that. So check that out, search my name in GTC to see more about that. Next question would be, what are some of the unique affordances of virtual architecture? What can we do in here, which we've already touched on a few, but these possibilities of not worrying about gravity, being able to do other things with material, with space. And you might think that there is a lack of restraint, which as an architect, we often thrive within certain limits of our site and our budget and all that. But there are still budgets. They're just different kinds of budgets. You might be able to make a 500,000 square foot building in VR, but can anyone actually render that on their computer? So instead of dealing with cost per square foot, it's polygon budget, and it's draw calls, and it's these other kinds of restrictions that you work within, where it might be very easy to create a real piece of architecture and plop a beautiful sculpture in the middle. But if that sculpture in the 3D version is, a billion polygons, you're going to have some fun trying to adjust for that. Burning Man, I'll just mention briefly that it was kind of interesting to be in a scenario where this was all being abstracted for virtual reality and the metaverse, and this used pixel streaming. And so there was still this social component, but you could also make it much easier to drive the art cars and see performances in different ways. But the Unreal Engine version was quite different from the AltSpace version, different metaverses in sync with each other, because the AltSpace version had to run entirely on a VR headset with no pixel streaming or anything like that. So you still got the social component, but much more abstraction for the actual events and the sculptures and everything there. So you're targeting different hardware and different audiences and dealing with those constraints. And when I actually think about some of the virtual projects I've been involved with, like this kind of set design work for the Unity for Humanity keynote last year with all this volumetric capture, I realized that it actually does often feel more like set design than traditional architecture, because especially when you're thinking about your polygon budgets and how you're going to make this thing render well in real time, and if it's in VR, not make people sick. Oh, my battery's low. Fun. I hope it dies right as my talk is over. That'd be great. It is a lot more like set design, actually. So then you can actually just think about what are people actually seeing, and not render the backs of things. Maybe that wall it can just have a front and not have a back. So there's some different kinds of approaches you can take. And you do still need to learn this. We'll go into that a little bit. Back on this idea, though, of things like virtual Austin and virtual New York City, I was watching the first episode of Narcos Mexico on the plane over here, and every episode is starting with, this dramatization is inspired by true events, but certain things have been changed. And it occurred to me that I would love to see this kind of stuff more for virtual architecture. This project is inspired by real architecture, but to make it more dramatic and to make it a more compelling virtual experience, certain things have been changed. And then I'd love to see what people do with that. So with that in mind, we can start to think about other places we can find inspiration for virtual architecture, paper architecture, things that were never intended to actually be built, but still provide a bit of a theoretical framework to challenge our notions of what architecture can and should be. These can exist now as a virtual architecture. Things from Archigram, things from Lebbeus Woods, things from Mobius, Newton's Cenotaph, which actually was built in Sansar, and frankly, I was a little disappointed by the result. Some of these things actually work better in a 2D format, but it's fun to know that these are all possible to start to build in a way where you can experience them in a group with other people at human scale. We have films, times where you have impossible architecture, and film is often a place where you find real architects at work designing impossible things. So I look forward to it becoming more of a tradition where when a film releases, some of those CG assets actually become inhabitable spaces. I hope we see more of that. We got to chat with Alex McDowell, sorry, not too long ago about the ways that he thought about designing Washington, D.C. in a Minority Report, which again starts to think about not just the architecture, but how do you move through the city? How do these flying cars and roads work? And I'd love to be, not just watching that in a film in the context of one narrative, but experiencing that as I go to a virtual conference or are going to go buy some virtual real estate. The Night Cafe is a piece that I still recommend people check out because I've never seen anything, this came out in like 2016, but I've never seen anything that did such a great job of capturing what it feels like to spatially inhabit a painting. Finally, as I wrap up and my battery's going to die any second, I want to present this question of, can virtual architects make money? And what's interesting, of course, is if you're just designing a virtual piece of architecture that ultimately is going to become a real building, you can stop at a certain point and say, like, it served its purpose. But you are the master builder if your ultimate goal is that you want to create a virtual conference center or a virtual house and people are going to use it. So there's a little bit more work in that. And yet there are people like Andrea and Numina, myself, Kim Bauman-Larson, Sam, Pierre at MedXU Studio, who are all finding ways to actually get paid to design virtual spaces. So it is possible, but then you can also start to find virtual commissions. There's places like Decentraland and Somnium Space and VR Chat. In fact, I know some VR Chat creators that make $120K a year just designing virtual worlds on commission. Now, what's interesting, though, about places like Somnium Space and the Decentraland blockchain kind of based setups is there's context for them. You don't have each world and architecture existing in its own standalone instance. There's sightlines, and if you buy a piece of virtual real estate over here, it's closer to the hub where everyone spawns, and so that's more valuable than one over here. And maybe you end up with a mean neighbor who builds just a giant flat wall in front of your architecture, and that's frustrating, but there's something kind of interesting about the fact that it becomes much more contextual as that all gets built out. I don't want to dive too much into NFTs and cryptocurrency, but I'll just give a quick overview that, non-fungible tokens, you have this idea kind of like a very special baseball card that you can buy a thing and there's artificial scarcity and now you own it. So I think about the potential of that for things like digital twins. I'd love to own the virtual version of, the Guggenheim Museum or something like that, and then start to do some crazy things in there that you can't do in the real one, and then start to license that space out for different uses. That seems like a fun level of ownership that doesn't deal with like the New York City Planning Board and bureaucracy and fire code and some of the restrictions we run into in the real world. I'll mention the Mars House, which was the first NFT piece of architecture to sell for $500,000. A lot of folks think it was a publicity stunt, which is probably true. It's, there's nothing to stop you on the blockchain from asking someone to pay you $500,000 and then giving it back through other means. Because this space was designed in Unreal Engine probably in like half an hour, and there isn't even much you can do in there. It just exists. But another friend of mine her name's Shoshana, and she's working on a platform called Unbuilt, which is very much meant to be like an NFT system for buying virtual architecture and then inhabiting it and using it. And right now it's all using Twinmotion Cloud, so if you get something on unbuilt.world, then it's something you can hop right into and start to play with along with other people. So I'm excited for the potential of being able to buy virtual spaces and have there be something special about them, and most importantly, that you can inhabit them with other people. And for my part, I'm excited for when I can start to do something like my architecture thesis from 2010, which I think I estimated would have cost about $4.5 billion to create. Fort Jay on Governor's Island, an inverted theater with all these War of 1812 star fort sightlines inverted for theater purposes. There's a submarine that takes you to the island. All these wild visions of what could happen in this theatrical space, all abstracted to 2D images and a fun little 2009 augmented reality thing. Oh, we're only missing one slide as my computer shut down. That's fine. I can't wait until I can actually build that in VR and then have live shows going on there. That costs money, and people can actually go to them and enjoy them in a way that they would never be able to enjoy in the real world. So there becomes something kind of special about that. All we're missing is my slide where I had just kind of some final questions. You know, we didn't talk about AR. What's it mean when you can start to hire a really incredible architect to create their version of New York City? And as you walk around New York City, you have an overlay of that once HMDs get better. And then I also have a book list. And then some thanks to Andrea and Kim and Shoshana and Sam, who I've really enjoyed diving into the world of virtual architecture with. But if anyone wants to see my book lists, which is 3 slides of just like, go read these books and react to them, let me know. In any case, thank you very much for your time. I am happy to answer some questions. I'm also happy to ask you guys questions. Like, I want people thinking about things like, you know, can virtual architecture outlive real architecture? And does it age? And does it degrade? And, you know, if you think about like what video games looked like in the 90s, if virtual architecture was a thing then, how would we feel about being in those spaces now? Would it feel nostalgic, or would it just feel like, you know, people need to update their graphics card? Food for thought. Yes. Here comes a mic.
Hello? Yeah, we're on. We're in.
Yeah.
Just a quick one. I'm an architect and been practicing for about 10 years. And I've always been interested in the visualization aspect of architecture more than architecture itself. In fact, I think architecture is quite slow and bureaucratic, and my attention span's quite short. And this is a kind of coming together of a lot of things that interest me, and it feels like it's something that I'd like to maybe investigate further or step into. And I've also kind of got my finger in the crypto NFT world as well, and I wasn't quite aware of how much of this piques my interest. What advice would you give to somebody in my situation who maybe wanted to move into that world more at this point?
Yeah, great question. So I'd say start with some of the ready-made platforms. So there's places like VR Chat, for example. You can build a world in VR Chat, but you can also use something like Unity, and Unity has a plugin that goes into VR Chat. So then if you start in VR Chat and then you're like, I really want to customize this beyond what that platform supports, fine, the project's already in Unity and you can create your own custom version. You can use a really simple multiplayer plugin like Normcore and then release that to all your friends, and you say, hey, we can all hang out on here Friday nights. There's places like Facebook or Meta Horizon, which have some actually pretty cool world building tools that allow you to scale up and scale down collaboratively, but then it's stuck in there and you're never going to be able to get it out. Mozilla Hubs is a cool one because it's all browser based, and you can have people logging in from a phone or from their VR headset, and so the accessibility and interoperability of that is quite nice. But my favorite thing to do, I'm now at a level with Unreal Engine, of course, where I can get pretty advanced with particle effects and how everything looks and how scale works and how you move through the space. So I really enjoy creating custom builds of Unreal Engine that have multiplayer set up and start to do things that are just quite simply not possible in the real world. So as you start your approach in designing virtual architecture, always be thinking, how do you have certain moments that are not there as a gimmick? It's not just there because you can have it, but because it actually uses your architectural training in a way to take advantage of affordances that just aren't there in the real world.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the presentation. That was all really interesting to listen to. I was just wondering, when we're talking about designing virtual architecture, how much do you think that starts to overlap with actual game design, just in terms of what the functionalities of a space is? So the same way you have in games the difference between gameplay and graphics. Mm-hmm. If it's a game that runs purely on the graphic aspect, like, wow, look at the space, the attention span of the users can't be really held on for too long. So I feel like to make virtual architecture engaging and successful, it almost becomes something closer to a video game where you have to build in interactions, goals, and where do you think the line from one to the other is? At what point does virtual architecture becomes a different kind of game design in a way?
I really love that question, and there's a few different ways I can answer it, but to keep this to like a minute. First of all, yes, when you start to design virtual architecture, you have to start thinking like a game designer because, of course, there's going to be interaction. You need to think about how to optimize a world in ways that you never have to when you're just creating a 5 gigabyte Revit model. But also, and I don't want to denigrate game designers in any way, but because game designers are chasing the attention span all the time of someone in there, it's a little bit like, peddling candy or fast food, which is one kind of approach to how to keep people in a space. And I like to think an architectural approach is a little bit like a nice 5-course meal where you're trying to allow people to really enjoy just being in the space. It's not too often, it happens occasionally, it's not too often in video games where the goal is actually just to look around for 5 minutes and say, wow, this is a really beautiful space. So that's one of my hopes as architects get more involved in here, is that there will be more opportunities to take your time and not always feel like there's something you need to be clicking, 100 times a second. Sure. Great. All right. Thanks, everyone. I'll be around if you want to chat more, and feel free to email me or find me on Twitter at ibrews, IBREWS. Thanks very much.